Brad Bowman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to join you. Appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you on. Been meaning to do so for some time. For those who don't know you or are not familiar with your work, you are the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And now you focus on U.S. defense strategy and policy. And before that, where we got to know each other, you were on Capitol Hill. You were National Security Advisor to Senator Kelly Ayotte, who served on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And after that, Senator Todd Young on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Really both quite impactful senators in the area of foreign policy and national security. And before that, you spent 15 years on active duty as a U.S. Army officer. You flew Blackhawks, and you also served in Afghanistan. Brad, are you from a military family?
Not really. I mean, I had an uncle that served. My grandfather was in the Navy for a brief stint in World War II, but generally, no. I was raised as a family that respected service and respected the military, and as a middle class family. And the idea of service was interesting, and I also had to think about how to pay for college. And so I applied to the academies and was blessed to get into one or two of them. And
so you were okay. So I know you went to U.S. Military Academy, and you had another option.
Well, I applied to all of them. I wasn't smart enough to get into the Naval and Air Force Academy, but I also got into the Coast Guard Academy. So I picked West Point, and of course I've become an ardent partisan now. Beat Navy, but. Truth be told, I probably shouldn't have revealed that. I did apply to all of them, but was proud to be accepted at West Point. Went there and barely survived chemistry and physics, became a poli-sci major and learned a ton.
And when you went to West Point, did you know anybody in your class? I mean, it doesn't sound like you had anybody in your family who...
No, I was coming from rural Southern Oregon. And, as some of the listeners may know, you have to get a nomination from your member of Congress, and then you have to get an appointment. So it's a really robust process. And I did it, and I had parents that were supportive, I put my name in the hat and got there, and then off I went. A few weeks after high school graduation, and my life kind of changed from there.
Yeah, that's quite. I imagine high school in Oregon to West Point. That's a bit of a shock to the system.
Yes.
Was there ever a point you're like, what did I get myself into?
Yes. And anyone who tells you otherwise going through any of the academies is probably lying to you. They intentionally stress you out, right? They want to see, can you prioritize? Can you handle more than you've ever handled before, academically, physically, militarily? But, it was a transformative experience, and I think I'm better for it. It's one of those things that's good to have, as they say, in the rearview mirror. You're glad you're from there, but you're not sure you'd want to do it twice.
So when we met each other on Capitol Hill, and I found out that you had this great career in the military before Capitol, I couldn't believe it because you look so young. When did you enter the U.S. Military Academy?
I entered in 91, right after graduating from high school, and I graduated in 95, and then was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 95. Okay,
so you were there. It's pre 9/11. You have, and what was the military like when you entered there? It was the end of history. It was good times. America it was the unipolar moment.
Yeah, it was. It was a heady period, I'd say, and it was definitely 9/11. Had never heard of that. It had not happened, that horrific day, and Bosnia, Kosovo was the stuff that happened there after graduation. But we were kind of the unipolar power, and what does this mean? The Soviet Union was gone, but we still needed a military. The military was going through a big downsizing, obviously, after the Gulf War. And
peace dividend, right?
Peace dividend, right? As Americans would want to do. We love to cash in that peace dividend, and then we later kind of regret that a little bit. Kind of a trend we see over and over again. So commissioned in 95, and then went to flight school, and then on into my career.
All right, last question about your very cool history. When did you decide you wanted to fly Blackhawks?
Yeah, no, the way it works, and thanks for asking, the way it works in the academy is, everyone is ranked from the lowest cadet to the highest ranking cadet on military, physical, and academic. And so you put in your wish list for like all the little sub branches of the Army. And so I put aviation as number one, and I wasn't the smartest guy, but I was fairly well-rounded. So I was high enough ranked to get my top choice. So I got Army aviation, went there and competed, and got a transition into Blackhawks, which was pretty fun and exciting, and then the career started from there.
Well, we're going to talk about Afghanistan later on, but I know you served in Afghanistan. Did you ever get a chance to fly a Black Hawk in Afghanistan?
No, I didn't. So I was in Army Aviation flying actively as a platoon leader, company commander, that sort of thing for 7 years. And that, maybe we'll talk later, that's where I was on 9/11 in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. But then I applied to go back and teach at West Point. So I went and studied full-time, graduate school for 2 years, taught at West Point for 3. 1 year as a CFR fellow in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working for Lugar, doing his Middle East portfolio, traveling around to 7 countries, and then 2 years in the Pentagon, and then 6 months in Afghanistan, working under McMaster and McChrystal. Came back, got out kind of unusually at the 15.5-year mark. And then that's where my 8 years in the Senate started.
Yeah, that is unusual. Usually people who are there for 15 years are like, I'm going to take it to 20, right? And then you get the working age retiree benefits.
Yeah, there's
Did you not get good financial advice from your, the military personnel side of the house?
Yeah, no, it's my friends thought I was either stupid or courageous, foolish or courageous, and it was kind of 50-50 on where they came down. There's this, both inertia and financial incentive kind of push you at that point to stay, right? Because if I'd stayed 4.5 more years, I could have cashed in on that retirement. But studying politics and foreign policy at Yale, teaching at West Point, getting a little taste of it as a fellow under Lugar. And then going back to the Pentagon as a major, where you're basically deputy assistant coffee boy. It was like, oh man, I see some other options here.
Deputy assistant coffy boy, that's distinguished.
And no disrespect meant to deputy assistant coffee boys. All work is, if it's moral, then it's honorable, and all work is good. But I was at West Point, I was starting to write and publish and heady stuff, and I just loved the world of ideas and foreign policy and grand strategy. And I thought maybe I could contribute in a different way, and so. With my better half's support, we took a risk, and I literally was 2 hours away from accepting a job with defense industry, where I would have walked away from 15, 20 years of federal service with nothing to show for it when I got the call from Senator Kelly Ayout's office, and that basically was the break of a lifetime. And
Capitol Hill benefited from that decision, and Senator Kelly Ayout was really instrumental on a lot of the policies we'll get to when we talk about Afghanistan. Truly understanding the nature of the threat of terrorism, what was required to prevail in Afghanistan. She was quite prominent also in terms of how to prevail in Iraq. But let's talk about where you are today, kind of the experience teaching at West Point and Yale. Now you lead this center at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Why was that the move? And they didn't have, you're, as far as I'm aware, the first person to lead their center on military and political power. What is that about? Why is military power almost like, a gap area in the world of think tanks and foreign policy and national security thinking?
No, thank you for that question. Sincerely, I love to talk about our center because
go for it. Now's your time.
But I won't go on for 5 hours. So so I'll keep it short. But when you work on Capitol Hill, as I know you have a deep experience as well, you learn about the think tank community. You, as I like to say, you learn who's who in the think tank zoo, and who's strong at this and who's strong at that, and what the kind of leanings here are there and leanings there. And there's so many great think tanks.
Heritage is conservative, Center for American Progress, liberal, right? Or even more nuance than that.
But not just political leanings, but also kind of areas of particular strength. Hey, they're really good on the Indo-Pacific, or they're really good on the Middle East, and then also kind of culture, right? But I didn't hear during. I'm doing. We're clearly engaging in the defense policy making process, and I just wouldn't hear from a lot of think tanks. When I would reach out to them, it was more about the latest op-ed or wanting to hear themselves talk. And I said, there really is. Like I'm doing now, but there really is a need for a think tank to be outcome focused and be agile and be more and see the op-ed and the research as the first thing you do, not the last thing you do, and really want to make outcomes and gains for our country and do damage to our adversaries. And so I came across FDD. I admired their work. I admired the lack of ambiguity and what I would call moral clarity on good versus evil, on terrorism bad, authoritarianism bad, democracy good. I mean, things that used to be not controversial, that I still believe, and that having allies are not a liability; they're an asset, and they need to be nurtured. And so, just that moral clarity, that policy strategic clarity, combined with kind of a special forces of the think tank world, agility and outcome focus, was really appealing to me. But FDD was founded right after the 9/11 terror attacks, by the way. They were in discussions before it. I've learned if you want to learn about a think tank, learn about their genesis story. Why were they created and when? And that kind of tells you their DNA. And that's 9/11 is FDD's DNA. So there was a huge focus on terrorism, and on sanctions and Iran policy. But what I really wanted to do with this new center, which I helped establish under General H.R. McMaster's leadership, was to focus on the tools of power, the military and diplomatic tools of power, based on the belief that too often we have trouble converting battlefield success to political success or political outcomes like we've seen in Afghanistan, for example. And so I wanted to bring that agility and that outcome focused on the defense and diplomatic tools of power. And I wanted to kind of make it look at where there's going to be a decision made in the next 1 to 18 months time frame, and then roll in with the research and the publications and then the subsequent briefings, which is kind of key to try to get those decisions made in a way that will benefit the United States and our allies and do damage to our adversary.
So I want to come back to kind of translating battlefield success into political success. That's quite timely. But just before we leave your center, you mentioned Chairman of the center is H.R. McMaster. Of course, President Trump's national security advisor, retired 3-star general, quite accomplished historian. But you also have Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense and Director of Central Intelligence, prominent Democrat. Also, so is FDD and your work at the center nonpartisan or bipartisan? Yes. Is that
nonpartisan? Yeah, we're a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit and proud of it. We don't take money from foreign governments. Proud of it. Nonpartisan, proud of it. And we don't want to be partisan hacks. We want to be operating in the 40-yard lines, working with people, viewing our people of the other party not as our enemies and our adversaries, but our fellow citizens working together toward common good. And so that's why I'm so proud that Leon Panetta is on our board. And when we published our big Defending Ford monograph last December, he wrote the foreword for it, and it included a chapter by H.R. McMaster. And we have other dignitaries on our board as well.
Well, that's great work. You referenced before 9/11. Of course, we've commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. This might be the hardest anniversary since those attacks in 2001. Tell us about where you were, Brad, on 9/11, 2001.
Sure. No, thanks for the question. It's as I've said before, it's one of those events, and for people that are old enough where you remember where you were. My mother remembers where she was when Kennedy was assassinated, and people of our age and older remember where they were on 9/11. On September 11, 2001, I was an active duty U.S. Army officer and pilot serving as company commander of Charlie Company, 12th Aviation Battalion at 4th Belvoir, Virginia. We were an H-60 helicopter company. Our day-to-day mission was flying congressional staff and DOD leaders, pretty much everyone below the president around the mid-Atlantic region. And we also had a classified mission, related to kind of our nation's worst day. On that day, I made the decision as company commander to fly 2 of our Black Hawk helicopters down to Fort A.P. Hill in kind of middle Virginia to do a 9mm qualifying range. We were there when we heard that the first tower was hit. Like everyone, we thought it was an accident, and heard the second tower was hit. I made the decision, holy cow, we need to get back our helicopters back to Fort Belvoir because we might need to do missions. As we were getting in the van to get back to our helicopters, the range tower, kind of the person that runs the range, informed us that the Pentagon had been hit. And so we got in our helicopters and flew back as quickly as we could to our base, came in low and fast. Because
you were allowed to fly. Excuse me, just as
we were
allowed to fly. I would have assumed, I know obviously all commercial air was grounded after the second tower was hit, but yes. I never actually thought about what direction the military was given in terms of air assets and how that was organized. So you were able to return your Black Hawks back to station.
We were, and then it gets even more interesting that night. So that day we were instrumental in helping to get a lot of top leaders out of Washington, D.C. because we thought that maybe a subsequent attack might be coming. So there was an effort to get leaders for continuity of government and Pentagon purposes out of D.C., out of the big red target, to these hide sites.
This was a continuity of operations type.
Yes. Yeah. So we were focused on Army leaders, Pentagon leaders, getting them out of, and so that's what my unit was doing. I managed that from Fort Belvoir. And then that night, we got a request to go pick up Deputy Secretary of Defense Wolfowitz from one of these hide sites. So I put myself on that mission. And by that time, to get to your point, all aircraft in the United States were grounded. And so the only aircraft flying at that moment that I know of was the AWAC aircraft, the kind of the airborne radar aircraft, then the fighters, and then us. So we took off from our base at Fort Belvoir and went to the Hyde site to pick up Deputy Secretary of Defense Wolfowitz. We thought we were going to take him to CIA headquarters. When we were flying back, he informed us that he wanted us to go to the Pentagon. And so we diverted to the Pentagon, flying down the Potomac River. This is the night of September 11th. We bank hard over Memorial Bridge. There's still smoke rising off the Pentagon. We circled to land, as I had done several times before. Later I'd go there at least once or twice a week to our helipad. Our helipad was at the point of impact and was destroyed by the plane.
So this is the helipad at the Pentagon that was destroyed.
The helipad at the Pentagon, where we were going to land to drop him off, was at the point of impact and was destroyed. So we ended up landing in kind of the Cloverleaf on the freeway there, which had been shut down. And there were other emergency vehicles and other helicopters parked there. We got it. Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz knocked on the window, saluted, and walked off toward the still smoking hole in the Pentagon. And then we flew back to our base and actually got the fighter actually swooped down on us as we were on short final to Belvoir. I still don't know why he did that, whether he was having fun with us, but that startled everyone so much. And he hit his afterburners. People thought there was an explosion, but anyway, it's something I'd like to talk with that fighter. But anyway, the next day, the next few days, they started to bring the remains of those killed in the Pentagon to Fort Belvoir. Mortuary affairs teams did their important, tough work, and then helicopters were going out to Dover. And then on September 14th, my unit took the Pennsylvania congressional delegation to Shanksville. I flew as a flying spare. And so 3 days after 9/11, I was at Shanksville, and I'll never forget, thinking, how could a whole plane disappear? Of course, like all of our fellow citizens, we learned later that the heroism of the people on that board prevented that plane from hitting our Capitol or the White House. And then a few days later, all of this within the first week after 9/11, we took the Army Surgeon General to Ground Zero, flying right past. I could already start to smell Ground Zero when we were halfway through New Jersey, and then we flew right past Ground Zero, and I looked down on it, and then we landed on the USS Comfort, which is a hospital ship, which was docked Midtown Manhattan.
It was on the Hudson?
Exactly. And then the extraordinary thing for me was that just 3 weeks prior, so 2 weeks before 9/11, we flew right up the Hudson, the river there, on our way to the Sikorsky plant in Connecticut to pick up 2 Black Hawk helicopters. I leaned over in my right seat, I still have it in my photo album, and took pictures of the World Trade Towers. You can see the helicopter blades in my picture. And there I was 3 weeks later, and they were gone.
I haven't met anybody, I don't think, other than perhaps one encounter with President Bush, who I'm sure, I don't even know if President Bush went to all 3 sites within the week. I suppose he did. It's highly unusual, Brad, for anybody in the military at that time to go be at the Pentagon, World Trade Center, of course, Pennsylvania, it sounds like within a week of 9/11.
Yeah. No, it's a massive understatement to say that it made an impact on me. And,
okay, so you've described what you were doing, and as a U.S. military academy trained Army officer, I guess that's what you're trained to do, right? You don't think, you just carry out the mission. But as you reflect on it, or at the time, if you had a moment to think, what was going through your head? I mean, how are you processing? I mean, you're seeing so much. You're seeing the actual site of impact. You're transporting the Deputy Secretary of Defense back to the site. You're up in the World Trade Center. You're out Shanksville. I mean, this is a lot to take in, and obviously you're well trained, but you're still a relatively young military officer at the time.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. I'm still reflecting on it, like 20 years later, and I think most of the families that lost loved ones on the day, they're the ones that have truly suffered, and I think of them often, and especially on the anniversaries. I think, like a lot of Americans, there was just kind of a shattering of a sense of security and almost invincibility. And we were in those days right after 9/11, we were working late. We were expecting subsequent attacks. During the subsequent Ramadan, we moved aircraft to Andrews Air Force Base and had them on a shorter recall in anticipating additional attacks. And I remember one night driving home in my flight suit, and I needed gas. So I pulled into a gas station, and I was there and in the bright lights at night in the gas station. For the first time in my life, I thought I had a feeling of, am I safe here? And I had never felt that as an American before. And it sounds a little wimpy now to say it, but I felt that way. And so I think, I think back on the patriotism and unity, which seems so distant now with our politics being so tribal and vitriolic and increasingly dangerous. I think of the unity. I long for that unity that we had. I long for the clarity of good and evil that we had. And I'm still reflecting, I'm still learning, but I was blessed to be able to have the Army, like I said, go study full time for 2 years. And a large part of what I did there, in addition to studying foreign policy and grand strategy, was I asked myself, who were these people that did this to us? Who did this? Why did they do it? And what do we do about it? And that's why I spent 2 years full time basically studying that, and then shared what I learned with cadets the following 3 years.
And then some years later, you find yourself in Afghanistan with all that training and that experience in 9/11. Of course, we're in Afghanistan precisely because Al-Qaeda planned the attack from Afghanistan. And you're there with H.R. McMaster. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I went as an individual augmentee. So I was a major. I didn't deploy as part of a battalion or a brigade combat team. I deployed as an individual officer.
You didn't go with a unit. You're just.
I didn't go with a unit. I went by myself. So I went through kind of the pre-deployment training, and then deployed by myself as a staff officer. So at that point, I was a strategist. I was an Army strategist and no longer actively flying. When I went to grad school, I put the flying days behind me. So I was just a staff officer. And what I ended up doing there was helping to design and stand up in the first 3 months Task Force 2010. It was for the year. The focus of this task force, and your father actually, as part of his Commission on Wartime Contracting work, testified later and said that the second leading source of revenue for the Taliban was extortion of U.S. contracts in Afghanistan. So we didn't understand the magnitude of the problem at the time, but we knew that we had a problem in our supply network. So the purpose of this task force—
Just break that down. Extortion of U.S. contracts. For the listener who perhaps doesn't quite understand how that worked, just give us a kind of a rough example of what would happen.
Sure. Thank you for that. No, it's a great way to lay it out specifically. So you have patriotic, hardworking Americans and coalition partners in Afghanistan trying to do good and make a difference and help the Afghan people and create a more secure country. And so like people in USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, they have a budget. They want to spend that budget by the end of the fiscal year, or they won't get some of it the following year. And by the way, they want to do good. So they'll go build a school or a well or something like that. And they might sometimes do it outside of the security envelope. And then who shows up the next night or the next week but the Taliban, and basically makes clear that, hey, not first tier contractor, second, third, fourth, fifth tier contractor, you need to give us some of that money, or your family's going to die or you're going to die. And our contracting, our acquisition legislation was designed for peacetime Maryland, not wartime Afghanistan. And so what I'm describing was a forensic auditing exercise, an intelligence exercise, a contracting exercise. And so we stood that up, and later we found out that we saved, I'm proud to say, tens of millions of dollars from going in the hands of the bad guys. Clearly not enough, but we made a difference. And then in the last 3 months, when we had the whole transition between McChrystal and Petraeus, which we won't go through now, Petraeus brought in General McMaster to stand up combined joint interagency task force, Shafa-Fiat, focused on, wait for it, corruption in the Afghan government. Because if you believe that insurgency and counterinsurgency is a competition for governance to win the hearts and minds of the people, if you have a corrupt Afghan government, that is a existential threat to that government competing effectively in that competition for governance.
So much there. Talking about General McMaster, General Petraeus, General McMaster. I mean, some of these, leading lights in the U.S. military, and they all had their time in Afghanistan over this long war. But let's fast forward. Here we are, 20th anniversary, just after 20th anniversary of 9/11, and President Biden has pulled out the U.S. military from Afghanistan. The Taliban now controls the seat of government in Kabul. It happened in 11 days. The Trump administration put an agreement in place for this withdrawal of U.S. forces. The Biden administration, according to them, felt obligated. They couldn't negotiate their way out of it. And now we find a Taliban government made up of, let's say, 4 or 5 former detainees from Guantanamo Bay, and their Minister of Interior is Haqqani, who's wanted by our FBI and has these strong familial and personal links to the terrorist organization, the Haqqani Network, as deemed by our government. You, Brad, have been outspoken early on, seeing this train wreck coming, and have continued through the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal, along with H.R. McMaster, to highlight the concerns. Your first piece, before the Taliban came through and captured Kabul, anticipated this and identified steps we could take to, in your words, how to avert disaster in Afghanistan. Obviously, Brad, this has gone the way you feared most. Did this have to happen? Was it inevitable? So the question I'm going to start with, Brad, is if we would have maintained a residual force, that's fancy speak for 3,500 or 2,500 U.S. forces, keep a base in Bagram, would we have had to pull out anyway? Would we have lost U.S. forces? Would the government in Kabul have fallen to the Taliban if we would maintain that presence?
Thanks for the question. I've spent a whole heck of a lot of time writing and thinking about this, and everything I say with humility. And I know that there are patriotic, good-intentioned people on the other side of this debate. So I mean that sincerely. But with the mind that God has given me and the time that I've spent on this earth, my answer to your question is this is absolutely not the way it had to go down. This was a preventable and predictable disaster. President Biden repeated his playbook from Iraq in 2011. I was there in the U.S. Senate with a second row seat behind John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and Kelly Ayotte, warning the then Obama administration not to do a timeline-based conditions ignoring withdrawal from Iraq, with then Vice President Biden being the leading advocate for doing that. They blew them off. They did it anyway. That catalyzed a series of events that resulted in the ISIS caliphate. We had to return at a higher cost in 2014. President Biden was warned repeatedly by his intelligence community. I've laid this out in an NBC News piece. He was warned by his chairman, his own Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who oversaw the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 and should know, said, according to the New York Times, quote unquote, "We've seen this movie before, quote unquote, Mr. President." That movie being a conditions ignoring withdrawal that we come to regret.
So conditions ignoring withdrawal. Basically, you're saying, President Biden, he had history here, this in 2011 with Iraq. It's repeated here. That I don't care what the heck's going on the ground. I'm committed to pulling out.
Yes.
And I'm just going to pursue that, irrespective of conditions. And his Secretary of Defense, the former general, retired general, commander of Central Command, responsible for Iraq, Afghanistan, the greater Middle East, told him, we've seen this before, referring to Iraq. And what was the president's response?
Correct. The president's response was he and General Milley basically did at least 2 interventions, including right before the April 14th announcement. President Biden brushed those aside, brushed aside the warnings of his intelligence community that if we did such a withdrawal, that the Taliban and their al-Qaeda partners would make significant gains and potentially topple the government in Kabul. President Biden proceeded on April 14th to make the announcement, using the Trump administration agreement with the Taliban as a fig leaf, in my opinion, to do what he wanted to do anyways. Why do I say that? I say that because if you actually look at the February 2020 agreement, Part 2, paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, the Taliban committed to breaking with al-Qaeda. Anyone who's been paying attention more than 5 minutes would tell you they were never going to do that. And so we are in a 2-party agreement, and the other party never complied.
So your point here is responding to the Biden administration contention. The president himself has said as much, that we were bound, that is the U.S. government, the United States was bound to this agreement the Trump administration made to the Taliban that we would withdraw our forces. Biden extended it from the April timeline. It wasn't feasible. Obviously, it was till September. But your point is the Taliban was in breach. So as a kind of, if you really are going to hang your hat on that argument, we were not bound to it because they were in breach.
Correct. I mean, if we're going to be a legalist about this, which President Biden I think kind of is, then I mean, who would honor a private contract, a two-party contract, and the other party never complied from the beginning? So I mean, let's
about the argument that, listen, hey, but it was done, and it would just endanger more U.S. forces, right? And this civil war was ongoing; it's raging, and boots on the ground weren't going to stop it. So you just kind of need to pull the Band-Aid off, no matter what the cost, no matter how much it hurts.
No, thank you. I at this point, I've heard every counter argument, and I think I have a good one for it.
Well, good. I'm trying to get you fired up.
For that. We don't have enough time, probably, but I've got 20 years of evidence to say that if we provided some level of support for the Afghan security forces, that we could prevent the government from falling and prevent Afghanistan from being used as a safe haven and launching pad for international terror. We tried what the Indian endless war crowd wanted. We tried what Biden wanted, and look what we got. And here's an essential point, Roger, that I'd love to make with your permission, is a lot of people are trying to hang most or all of the catastrophe we're seeing in Afghanistan on how the withdrawal was conducted rather than the decision to withdraw itself. And that's a fundamental point, because in the coming months, years, and maybe even decades, people are going to be pointing fingers. I don't care who's up or down the polls. It's not about the next election. But we got to stop the self-delusion, and we got to really get to the bottom line. The bottom line is we would have ended up where we are today, even if we have done the withdrawal perfectly. Maybe we would have got more Americans out. Maybe we would have gotten more Afghan special immigrant visas out. But you would have ended up in 6 months or 2 years with a Taliban-controlled, al-Qaeda partnered government in Kabul, with all that means for a terrorist safe haven and all that means for Afghan women and girls and refugee flows and so forth.
So it was inevitable in your mind, even if there would have been a more orderly withdrawal of U.S. forces, right? So let's just say we didn't pull our U.S. military forces out of Bagram Airfield and kept them there to have a more orderly evacuation effort for U.S. citizens. The point is, I hear you making, is that the Taliban always intended, as you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, to isolate and overthrow the government in Kabul. It would have happened. But the key point is that the Biden administration says that pressure from the Taliban would have only increased if we would have stayed, and it was questionable whether or not the U.S. forces, the mere presence, would have done enough to sustain this ineffective government in Kabul. Friendly, but ineffective.
Roger, we could have a lengthy and substantive discussion. I would welcome at some point about all that went wrong with the 20-year U.S. effort in Afghanistan. There's much to criticize. I am not here to say that it was conducted perfectly. I could give you a 2-hour lecture on that. But here's the point, and I really think this is important context for your listeners to consider. We had somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 troops in Afghanistan in April when Biden made the announcement. Okay. Those numbers are like, okay, what does that mean? Let's just say 3,000. Let's put the number 3,000 in context. We have 486,000 active duty U.S. Army troops, 486,000. You know how many we had on Capitol Hill after January 6th? We had 26,000. We had 26,000 U.S. service members on Capitol Hill after January 6th. We had 3,000 in Afghanistan. What were we as a country getting for that investment of 3,000? We were preventing the catastrophe we're seeing now. We were securing the gains that Afghan women and girls made. We were preventing another 9/11 attack from that country. And we were preventing refugee flows to destabilize nuclear armed Pakistan. I, for one, think that America is a great power and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And we could have retained, pick your number, 3,000 to 5,000 in that country. And we could have prevented this from happening. What were we doing? And this goes right directly to the president's point. We were providing intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, training, advice, and assistance, and air support and contract support. Okay. We were not at that point. At one point, we had 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. We were down to around 3,000.
Well, yeah, that gets this nomenclature forever wars, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
You have good language in your op-ed that you wrote subsequently after the things went out of control in Afghanistan. when he decided to withdraw, it was 3,500 forces he laid out. It wasn't the forever war, to some people who thought it was, call it that, ended in 2015 or 2016 when we had these steep drawdowns. And I think you could argue, tell me if you disagree, that basically between 2016 and 2021, we have taken an economy of force approach in Afghanistan where we basically said, what's the minimal footprint required to counter the terrorist threat and to sustain this government in Kabul? Not because we're trying to turn Afghanistan into some Western democracy, but just because that's the minimum necessary, so we internalize the lesson of 9/11, which was we can't allow this place to be a safe haven, because if we do, terrorists will plan and carry attacks against our interests and perhaps the homeland.
No, that's exactly right. Without belaboring the point too much, I mean, we've long had in this country individuals on the far left and the far right who have never seen a military deployment they didn't want to withdraw. I get that. That's fine. That's their position. What we now have is people in the center, China hawks, and I consider myself a China hawk. I consider China the number one threat we confront, but and unambiguously so. But then some people follow that principle and correct position of being a China hawk with, and therefore we need to withdraw from the Middle East or South Asia. And my response to that is great power competition is a global one, and it happens in the Middle East too. And if you're only concerned about competing with China, the last thing you want to do is what we did in Afghanistan, because what do we think the NSC has been focused on for the last month? And in the end, you're going to have to go back and invest more resources in Afghanistan, just like you did in Iraq. So if your only focus is in China, this was a bad idea. And maybe some of your listeners and viewers have seen the article about China potentially being interested in occupying Bagram Air Base, the base we just gave up a few weeks ago. So, are we a great power or not? Do we stand by our allies? Do we believe in democracy? Do we believe that our interests sometimes require us to defend forward and confront terrorists there and to deprive them of breathing space so they can't kill us here? That seems to be one of the core lessons of 9/11. And I fear that too many of our political leaders have forgotten that. Yeah,
well, I think you're right on the great power point. The definition of great power for me is a country that can do more than one thing at a time. And in this 21st global economy, you have to be dominant in multiple regions of the world. You can't just pick one and ignore the rest. Is the Taliban our enemy?
Yes, absolutely. The Taliban has the blood of hundreds and thousands of Americans on their hands. The Taliban is a misogynist, a murderous terrorist organization, and recognizing them as a legitimate government of Afghanistan would be a grave mistake.
Do you think we're on the cusp of recognizing them?
I believe because President Biden implemented a timeline-based withdrawal that ignored conditions on the ground and left behind 100 to 200 Americans and thousands of Afghan special immigrants, visa partners who are vulnerable, and some of whom are being hunted as we speak. Because he did that, he created an opportunity for terrorist extortion, where the Taliban can make demands of us in order to get their cooperation to get our citizens out. And what are they asking right now? Almost certainly, this is me guessing with educated guesses, they want sanctions relief so they can travel the world and fundraise. And be clear, Taliban fundraising is Al-Qaeda fundraising. It's Haqqani fundraising. And they want recognition. And they understand that roughly 80% of their economy is coming from international aid. And so they understand that international aid won't flow without recognition, and key to that recognition is American recognition.
I think the aid is already continuing in.
Some of it is, but it won't flow the way they want it to and need it to unless you get the Western powers coming in and supporting some of that. But you're exactly right. So you'll oppose all of that. I mean, there's So the Taliban. I am not willing to outsource American counterterrorism to the Taliban, and the reason I'm not is because the Taliban and Al Qaeda are attached at the hip. And
two more questions on that, because you've written with H.R. McMaster. I'll read you. Say, someone in Washington draw a bold line between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. In reality, those groups are intertwined, and a Taliban victory is a victory for the group that murdered nearly 3,000 innocents on 9/11. If you talk to Secretary of State Blinken, he would simply say, right now, it's in the Taliban's interest to cooperate with us. So just shy of saying that we should recognize them, but kind of not hitting the point of whether they're intertwined, just saying we can work with them. You don't think we can work with them?
there's no higher priority than getting Americans to safety. And I used to proudly say Americans don't leave Americans behind. That's what the Biden administration did here, and I think it's shameful. The real quick, Roger, if I may, Al Qaeda, the current interim prime minister of the just announced Taliban government, Akhund, he's the one that said after 9/11, quote, "We will never give up Osama bin Laden at any price." And the other quick point I would make is that it's the Taliban didn't just not separate from Al Qaeda. They actually coordinated with Al Qaeda over the last 4 to 6 weeks. A lot of people are like, how did the Taliban do so well in the north where there aren't as many Pashtuns? The answer is that they worked with Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda affiliates who are Tajiks and Uzbeks. So not only did they not separate, they coordinated their offensive. And so they remain attached to them. So if you recognize the Taliban, you're recognizing Al Qaeda.
What about President Biden's argument that says, listen, the Taliban they're not good guys. It's not like we trust these guys. But in his judgment, we could address the terrorist threat through, quote, over-the-horizon capabilities. You write with H.R. McMaster that approach failed in the 1990s and is failing again now. U.S. aircraft flying from the Persian Gulf to conduct sporadic airstrikes can't stop the Taliban's onslaught. Was the basic lesson of 9/11, from a military standpoint, from a strategist standpoint, somebody who served in the military for 15 years like yourself, who studied in West Point and taught at West Point, was the basic takeaway is over the horizon doesn't work?
America is the most mobile, lethal military in the history of the world. We're better at over-the-horizon counterterrorism strikes than any military in the world. No other military could have done what we did at Kabul Airport. Our service members were heroes in what they did at Kabul Airport in a horrible situation that they should have never been in. But we tried the over-the-horizon approach in the 1990s when President Bill Clinton launched a few cruise missiles at some empty tents. Didn't work then. You know when else we tried the over-the-horizon technique? We tried it in the month of August, and it failed. And we went from August.
That was in response to the attack around Kabul Airport where 13 U.S. troopers were killed.
Well, yes, but before that, I mean, if I were to say that, the 2 or 3 things that really brought about catastrophe, I would say the Trump 2020 deal with the Taliban basically gave a certain date withdrawal. So the Taliban started going around to provincial leaders and say, they're leaving, join us or die. And then pulling air support and pulling contract maintenance and logistics support. And those were both Biden decisions. And if you listen to Afghan commanders, they'll tell you those were the kind of the triple blow right there. That's what took us from a situation where the Taliban didn't control a single provincial capital on August 4th or 5th to overthrowing the country in 11 days. So, So I think it's pretty clear. We
got to jump to our lightning round here, but before we exit this conversation on 9/11 and Afghanistan, you hear a lot of people talking about remember 9/11. Is your biggest concern is that we're not remembering the right thing as we deal with Afghanistan today? That we've forgotten the most important things to remember from 9/11?
I think so. It's so difficult to succinctly summarize something that's so profound for our country. But you mentioned, just very quickly, if I may, you mentioned that forever wars are ending endless war narrative, and Secretary Panetta, whom we mentioned, who's on our board and served as Secretary of Defense and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, wrote the foreword for that monograph in December I keep mentioning. And he made the point in there that, every military intervention requires scrutiny. Every military campaign requires scrutiny. And every military withdrawal also requires scrutiny. It's not an incoherent belief to say that it was a mistake to invade Iraq in 2003, and it was also a mistake to withdraw in 2011. That is a coherent position. And we need to stop blurring decisions to start with an intervention or how you conduct it with the decision to withdraw. And we have to understand that not everything is about us. Sometimes there's just evil people in the world that need to be opposed. And if you don't oppose them there, you're going to see them on the streets of New York. And so to me, that's a core lesson.
Sobering words from Brad Bowman, our guest. We're going to move to our lightning round, which is where our guests share their favorite Reagan quote, speech, or book. Give us 1, 2, or all 3. What do you got, Brad?
So thank you. No, when I heard that this question might be coming, I started to feel overwhelmed because it'll sound like I'm playing to my audience. But my first political memory was a Jimmy Carter State of the Union address. That'll tell you how old I am and what a geek I was at an early age. But then I thoroughly was a Reagan kid growing up, and there's so many. This will show what a C-SPAN geek I am when I say that probably my favorite is President Reagan's March 23, 1983 speech, which is widely known as a Star Wars speech. But I don't love it for the Star Wars reason. I love it because if you look at the first part of that speech, he talks about how we should determine how much we spend on defense. Mm-hmm. And he has a quote in there where he talks about, don't tell me that you want to cut this much money or this percent or this many $1 billion. Tell me what you want to do without, and why we don't need that, and what risks we're going to take as a result of that cut. At this time, in this place, in this moment, where I see great power competition with China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism like we've been discussing, threats getting worse, not better, I just don't understand how this administration can be proposing a defense budget that doesn't even keep up with inflation. So I would love for folks, I might even tweet that, I'd love for folks to go back and look at what Reagan said about the right way to determine defense spending. It's not about cutting X percent or Y percent. It's what do we need to do to defend our country? That's where you start.
Brad Bowman, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for being on the show. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.